Everyone for coming. Introducing Dr. Lee Stoner. So Lee's coming from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he's a recent associate professor in the Department of Exercise and Sports Science. So I'll give you a lot to talk about, but I'll give you a brief introduction, give you a little bit of his qualifications. But comes from a similar background as many of us. He got his bachelor's in sports science from Brunel University, London.
Except for the Zoom thing.
From England, but he's moved over to the States. He finished graduate work at the University of Georgia, both master's and PhD in exercise physiology. He worked with Dr. Kevin McCullough. Some of you know him. A lot of vascular, a lot of muscle related research. And then from there, he actually moved overseas, accepted a lecturer position, equivalent like assistant professor here at Massey University in New Zealand. And what's interesting is because he's got a physiology background, sports science background, but he's also got an MPH, also from which he was able to attain while he was at Massey. I'll interject a fun little story here. While he was at Massey, him and I were good friends at that point, but he invited me up one summer to do a quick little research project. We had a couple of projects planned, but I brought my wife with me. Well, at the time she wasn't my wife, but I was able to propose to her, and we were engaged in New Zealand on a nice vineyard in the mountains. And now my kids call him Uncle Lee. But kind of moving on, I'll talk a little briefly about some of his honors. He's got a lot of great honors. He's a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine. He's also a registered clinical exercise physiologist. And he has several prestigious awards, one of which was the University Research Medal at Massey, which is quite a prestigious award for some of the research that he's conducted. So about some of his research, he'll talk a little bit more about it, but Lee likes to examine the interactions between lifestyle factors and cardiometabolic health. He's got a specific interest looking at sedentary behavior in young adults. He also examines and develops and interprets new ways, new non-invasive methodologies for studying cardiovascular function in health. And of course, given the title of his talk, he's going to talk about translation of basic and applied science into public health outcomes. That's where it all kind of comes together, right? When it comes to the policymakers. In terms of publications, he's got nearly 300 publications, peer-reviewed publications. He's brought in nearly $40 million between pending, active, and completed grants. Lots of great things. I feel compelled to tell one more fun story. But anyway, return to favor. Lee came to Mississippi when I was there at Southern Miss, and decided to show him New Orleans, Louisiana. And we got to see the French Quarter, and I took him to the French Market area. There was this one particular place that we saw. It was called Pepper Palace. So Pepper Palace has hot peppers and hot sauces from all over the world. We decided we'd try some of them. Actually, we decided to try the hottest one on the market. I think it was called Flashbang, the hot sauce. Somewhere 20 million Scovilles and that kind of stuff. But we had to sign a waiver and everything to try it. But by the time it was done, I can tell you, topical burns and GI distress were understated. But nonetheless, we were covered and we don't have to do great many things. So Lee, thanks for coming, where he's going to give us a talk. His title of his talk is Interrupting Sedentary Behavior to Mitigate Cardiovascular Disease Risk, Considerations for Policy Development. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you so much for having me here. And it's been an awesome day meeting so many cool folks. I'm really impressed by just the cohesiveness of your department and all the interactions between different areas and so on. And your new facilities, Jermaine gave me a tour earlier on. I'm going to go back to Chapel Hill and boast about you and tell them we need to do some things a bit different. I wasn't going to tell you a bit about me, but Dan stole my thunder. I am from England. I mean, you can tell, right? Because I'm suave and debonair. I'm also a citizen of New Zealand. They call themselves Kiwis after the Kiwi bird. So I call myself a Britwee. I've applied for my American citizenship. So my daughter told me I'm going to be an Ameri Britwee next year. And I should have that before the next election, which I really want to vote in. I won't tell you about my education. Dan just did all that. This is my family. And this is the rest of my family. And the mission of my lab, the cardiometabolic lab, Number one is mentee development. This is my biggest passion. Like, I really like helping with the personal development of mentees at different levels, and I try and ensure they develop 3 skills, which are leadership, communication, and self-promotion, which is very different for academics, right? Because we're taught to be kind of humble and stuff. But if you don't tell people how good you are, how are they going to know? And then, of course, there is the science, because this doesn't come without the science. So this is our current team of postdocs and graduate students, and I do mentor for a lot of different programs. This is most of the list. I'm missing a few, but we have a very active lab, which is really cool. And as Dan said, I'm interested in lifestyle behaviors, particularly sedentary behavior, and then developing non-invasive techniques and public health. But enough about me.
Hello,
You came here to
my
learn a
name
bit.
is Lee.
That's not
Stoner.
supposed to. I copied a slide across from another one because I updated my title slide. But to get back to the talk, so we need to learn about sedentary behavior, which is a behavior that's been garnering a lot of attention in the press over the last few years. And you see slogans such as "sitting is the new smoking," etc., etc. But what is all the hoopla about this behavior? Why is it important? Why do we need to change it? How do we change it? And that's what I'm really interested in. So today I'm going to briefly talk about why sedentary behavior is important. We're then going to take a step back in time and take an evolutionary view of how this behavior developed. And then I'm going to tell you where we stand with the current policy and point out the gaps. And then we're going to look at, well, we know these gaps. We know we need to develop it. So how do we do that? And then I'll finish by talking about some of the things we're doing in our group. So let's start here with why sedentary behavior is important. Before we do that, I think it's important that we have definitions, because these terms are used interchangeably and they're not. And I feel bad because I'm always correcting people and saying, you're using that wrong. But we know physical activity is movements via any muscle actions that increase energy expenditure. And of course, exercise comes under that umbrella term, right? It's planned, it's repetitive. And then we have physical inactivity, which people think is the same as sedentary behavior, and it's not. It's the lack of physical activity. It's not a behavior in and of itself. And then we have sedentary behavior, by which we are referring to very low intensity behaviors. We use 1.5 metabolic equivalent in a seated, reclined, or supine posture, and while we're awake and conscious, of course. Here's another way of looking at it that we publish. So you've got sleep. That's none of those behaviors, right? You're not conscious. The physical the sedentary behavior is here below 1.5 METs. Standing, people use that as low intensity behavior. Sometimes it's kind of in no man's land. We have shown it is less than 1.5 METs, so it's not an LPA. But I'm not going to go on about that one. Just to know that one is a bit confusing. But then we have light physical activity through to MVPA when we go above 3 METs. So hopefully we're on the same page then when I talk about these terms. And why is it important? Well, if we look at MVPA, we know it's super important. We know it has fantastic health benefits, but it's only about 3% of our day. If, that's a big if, right? We are achieving those guidelines, which most of the population is not. Then we look at sedentary behavior, which then is most of the rest of our waking hours. And these are just numbers I made up to look pretty for a graph, but I put 7.5 hours. But the average adult is closer to 10 hours, as being nice here. So it's a major behavior that many of us partake in every day. And we know now, thanks to comprehensive, that the relationship between sedentary behavior and cardiovascular disease has been adjudicated as strong. And so this is from National Physical Activity Committee, but the WHO have now released the same statement. So that association exists, at least at an epidemiological, if not a physiological level. Now, this is a meta-analysis of individual data points with over a million subjects done by Eklund and his group. And they broke down sedentary behavior into quartiles. So they don't, you may not see those clearly, but this is less than 4 hours, 4 to 6, 6 to 8, and over 8 hours a day of sedentary behavior. And then we got physical activity. So over here, this is less than 2.5 Met hours a week. That's like pretty much no physical activity. 16 Met hours a week. This is pretty much where our guidelines are. 30 Met hours and then over 35 Met hours. This is about 70 minutes a day, every day. So this is really high. Now, what I want to point out, if we look here at the guidelines and then look at this figure, that this is hazard ratio. So this line here, this is 1. If one of these points falls on that line, no increased risk if you're getting that much physical activity and sedentary behavior. Now, if we look at, as we go through the categories of sedentary behavior, when we're meeting physical activity guidelines, the physical activity is not protecting. You still have increased risk of all-cause mortality. In fact, there doesn't seem to be a major protective effect of physical activity till we get to here, about 70 minutes a day. Who's exercising 70 minutes a day, every day? Anyone in this room? Jume? Okay, so we've got one freak in here, but no one else does, right? So that's why he's standing over there. So just like some take-home messages so far. We know sedentary behavior is strongly associated with cardiovascular disease. We know achieving physical activity guidelines is not protective, and therefore we believe that sedentary behavior is a distinct physiological behavior that is leading to cardiovascular disease pathology. This is a picture I found of there's Dan and there's Jume being very sensible, not drinking more than one here, of course, at a conference. Okay, let's take a step back in time. I find this part really fun. If we look at our Paleolithic ancestors, so about 50,000 to 10,000 BC, those ancestors were dependent on hunting and gathering. Now, if there are any anthropologists in the room, I apologize, I'm generalizing. Not all populations did that, but a lot of the people that we came from did. And because of this, we know, and we know that in the last 10,000 years, our genes have not changed. That is not enough time for us to have genetic adaptation. And because of this hunter-gathering lifestyle, we are genetically programmed to be physically active. However, we are also programmed to conserve energy. So we are programmed to do both things. So with our hunter-gatherer populations, sedentary behavior was a positive threat. We needed to conserve energy because we went through feast or famine. So the energy that we had stored in our, we had to preserve until the next meal came along. So this population was feel likely sedentary, and I'll show you some data in a moment. Yet there's no evidence for atherosclerosis in these populations, in the studies that we found and done MRI stuff on them. So, we did have to account that lifespan was shorter, but we see atherosclerotic lesions in 10 to 20% of young adults and fatty plaques in kids. So it does happen from a young age, and it's a continuous insidious process. But in this population, nothing. The obvious question is also, they engaged in a lot of sedentary behavior, but what did that behavior actually look like? There's no way to know for sure, but we can make some best guesses by looking at indigenous populations that are relatively untouched, such as the Hazda population, which are shown here in Tanzania. Now, if we look at this population, so this was done, I'm going to mention him more in a bit, but by Racklin and Herman Ponce. This is a friend of mine, and he'll come back up. But he recorded that this population are sedentary for about 9.8 hours every day, and that the average length of a sedentary behavior bout was 15 minutes. Now, look to modern populations, we're about 9.5 hours with 21-minute length bouts. So there's actually minimal difference in sedentary behavior patterns between our ancestors and between us. And then again, here's Ponce I was referring to. He looked at this population and he categorized what they were doing, what they were sitting. They're not sitting the same way as us. They were kneeling, squatting, or sitting on the ground. And if we look at squatting, that's like 20% of their time was engaged in this behavior. Another cool thing that they did, and can address this part, why is this important? Well, their sedentary behavior is kind of active. You can't see it very well here, but they put EMG sensors on this population and followed them around. And when they're squatting, these different muscles are highly engaged. So these bars are representing the percentage activity of the muscle relative to walking. And they're highly engaged when they're squatting. So they're not sitting the same way that we do. So just to take home then, if we look at our ancestors, our sedentary behavior patterns, the duration was similar, but the how, that was different. So that might be why they had more of a protective effect than we did. This is for no particular reason. This is a cassowary bird. I just put it up there because I like it. This is the heaviest bird in the world. You find it in Northeast Australia and Papua New Guinea. Unfortunately, it's endangered, but they are really cool birds. But again, nothing to do with sitting. So now let's look at where we are with the current policy and where did this all start? Well, it started back in 1953, which is now known as the bus conductor study, right? This is Jim Morris, known as the father of exercise, of physical activity. And he showed that the bus conductors had a decreased incidence of coronary heart disease versus the drivers. So that was the first time that this relationship was explored in any way. Now, fast forward, we have a lot of data now showing that exercise or physical activity is really beneficial for us if it is moderate to vigorous. So this is men and women. So we look at the women here. This is moderate to vigorous physical activity. The LPA is not really doing very much. Like, we still have high death rates, but the moderate to high, we know that's really important, right? And this is useful data because this is objective. It's from accelerometry, not self-report, but there are lots of other studies that can show you a similar thing about MVPA being protective. And there's enough data for us up with specific guidelines, right? You've all heard of the FIT principle. And we now have over 70 years of research supporting this principle. What we don't know still fully is how exercise protects. This was a review published by Danny Green a few years back now, and it's estimated about 65% of the protective effect of exercise is unknown. It was postulated that this is probably related to the direct hemodynamic effects that exercise has and the relationship between those hemodynamics and the vasculature. But even though we don't know all of this, there's still enough evidence for policymakers to recommend exercise. Again, though, this is only a small portion of our day, right? Super important, but small portion. This, we know a lot less about. These are some of the policy that's been published by different countries. So this is Canada. They're breaking down by the 24-hour clock. I don't know if you saw, Jume gave a great talk on this a few years back at ACSM. But they sort of give guidelines around how much physical activity, sedentary time, and sleep. I'll get to where we're at in the US. There's some guidelines in here. We should have less than 8 hours a day, limit screen time, and not sit for prolonged periods. This is not based on solid evidence, but we have enough to believe it's not going to have a negative effect, right? Australia has done something very similar of their 24-hour guidelines. Belgium have made this nice little figure showing what you should be doing at different periods of the day. So this is spreading, right? This 24-hour clock policy movement. These are our guidelines. Move more, sit less. Right, that's the extent. And you can't blame the guidelines because the research is not there. Like, we know we should be recommended 150 minutes per week of MVP8, lots and lots of research to support that. We know all of us should be sleeping about 7 to 9 hours. The evidence to support sedentary behavior interruptions is not there. So the best we can do right now is to say, move more, sit less. Why? Well, as I said, we have limited mechanisms to understanding. Sedentary behavior is a biologically novel behavior, but we don't understand very well at all how it is leading to cardiovascular pathology. And if you don't understand the mechanism, then you can't develop an optimal dose of sedentary behavior interruptions. Now, the thing that I always get is, sitting, why don't you just tell people to sit less, right? So I respond with, all right, then you go and exercise more, you eat better, you sleep better, you stop smoking, etc. Does that work for any of you in here? No, especially if they're that vague, right? Just telling someone to stop, it does not work. And keep in mind, compared to physical activity, sedentary behavior is arguably much more amenable to change. It's easier to motivate change in that behavior. So take home so far, we have pretty good guidelines for physical activity, but there's data back to 1953 driving it. Sedentary behavior policy has arrived, but it's currently non-specific, and just telling people to stop it doesn't have any impact. So just to go on the bird thing, and so that bird was from Australia. This is from New Zealand, and I wanted to show that New Zealand is better. This is the giant moa. This is the biggest bird that ever lived. Unfortunately, it got hunted to extinction when the Maori landed in New Zealand, so it's not there anymore. But it's a far cooler bird than the Australians have. So now let's dig a bit deeper then. So we want to develop that policy. But what are the things that we need to consider? Unfortunately, a lot of interventionists go with the Islagate approach, which means it seemed like a good idea at the time, right? We do the intervention, it doesn't work. You got to do another one, and none of them work, right? Because we start with the intervention rather than trying to figure out what needs to go into the intervention. So why don't we actually look at what policymakers are looking for when they are developing policy? Right, and I'm speaking just about guidelines here. This is policy in general. There are many types of policy. So I like to use the US Preventative Services Task Force. This is policy for primary care providers to prescribe actions that will be preventative to poor health outcomes. Now, I'm not necessarily interested in primary care per se, but I use their framework because it's really well described and available, and it's comprehensive. And the policy framework is similar across other bodies. These just it's much more elaborate. Now, when the policymakers are looking, they are looking at 3 stratas of evidence. They look at the individual studies and they weight those studies based on the study design. So an RCT normally will get a higher score, and the internal validity. Then they want to know this linkage. So we've got all these studies showing the connection, say, between physical activity and health outcomes. They want to know there's a linkage between all those different studies. And then they don't just want a linkage, they want to be able to show there's a causal connection. right? That biologically plausible relationship between that preventative service and the health outcome that they want to achieve. If they look through the literature, and normally the literature is summarized using meta-analysis, right, and systematic review, so that's considered the highest level of evidence. If they look through and see, okay, now there are multiple meta-analysis and multiple systematic reviews, they're coming up with a similar answer, the pieces fit together, they will now decide whether they're going to go ahead with policy, and then they'll give it a score, A, B, C, based on the magnitude of the net benefit, whether it can be extrapolated and whether it can be generalized across populations. And it looks something like this. So a person comes in, they get screened, and you've got to be able to measure it, right? So whatever it is, you've got to be able to measure it. It's got to be able to be observed. If they're screened and this poor behavior is being exhibited, they will administer a treatment. Now, we don't measure end outcomes. We can't give a treatment and see if they die or not, right? That's not a good way to give a treatment. So we have to have an intermediate outcome, and that intermediate outcome has to be on the causal pathway. So like a really nice, simple framework. Now, how do we put those pieces of the framework together? So I'm proposing, and I made all this up, so if I'm wrong, sorry. But I'm proposing, first we do need the preclinical work, but then we need to be able to identify the behavior. We have to really understand it. We then, once we've identified it, we can then start to design the intervention and test those design elements. We can then deliver the intervention. And then the last step that we often forget about is the implementation side of things. Who's going to deliver those guidelines, right? I mean, it's one thing that the US Preventative Service is developing these guidelines, but is anyone actually going to administer them? And how does that happen? And that's far more challenging than any of the other steps. So in the next slides, and I have to acknowledge here, I am not an implementation scientist. I'm not a behavioral scientist. I'm not even an intervention scientist. I'm a physiologist with public health training. So, but I need to know enough so I can communicate and work with teams who are much better than this at me. And the frameworks, and in developing these ideas, a lot of frameworks and theoretical models were used. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to this. It's really, really complicated. The literature is really muddy. But starting with the preclinical part, we have to establish biological plausibility. But we have to understand the mechanism by which that behavior is leading to the pathology. That's a crucial element of most policymakers. They want to see biological plausibility. Yeah, and unless you have biological plausibility, you cannot select an appropriate intermediate outcome. That intermediate outcome has to be associated with that mechanistic model that you have developed. And then we have to consider various forms of validity. So the obvious one that as physiologists we always consider is internal validity, right? A cause and effect relationship between the treatment and outcome. But it doesn't mean we don't think about external validity at this stage, which is the generalization of that causal relationships, different measures, persons, settings, and times. And then another one that is not considered, which is a subcategory of external validity, is ecological validity. Do these conditions actually play out in the real world? So, as I said, biological plausibility is a key element. This is the model that we have developed for our sitting-based research. I'm not going to go through all of this because it will take far too long, but we basically believe when people are sitting, they get blood pooling, and it leads to this cascade of hemodynamic, hormonal, and metabolic changes that increase aortic arterial stiffness and then lead to myocardial burden. So again, I'm not going to explain all that, but we are going to come back to that, this hemodynamic one, because we think this is a particularly important pathway and one which we can develop interventions around. So now that we've got biological plausibility, we've got a model that we can work on, we need an outcome that's going to enable us to gauge whether that model works, right? So as I said, we are using aortic arterial stiffness, because we believe the blood pooling leads to decreased venous return. And then if you're pumping less blood out of the aorta, that's going to lead to endothelial dysfunction and oxidative stress. And we have to remember that arterial stiffness has functional and structural components. It is dependent on endothelial function too. So if that is disrupted, it becomes stiffer. Now you're shooting these pressure waves down to the heart, and you're increasing myocardial burden. So this is our mechanism, and we know if this mechanism is important, we can start to interrupt it, right? We can develop strategies that are going to activate the muscle pump, which is our greatest mechanism for venous return. So again, we're measuring aortic arterial stiffness, and we think it's been driven by blood pooling. Now, we do, as I said, have to think about internal fluidity, and this is something we give a great deal of thought to as physiologists. Typically, one that hasn't been given as much attention, and I'm a methodologist, I like looking at these nerdy things, is when we're making measurements, what posture do we do it in? So we're measuring aortic pulse wave velocity. The guidelines, the whole model has been built around taking them in the supine posture. But most people are taking measurements while people are still seated. The method and all the assumptions and the physics around this measurement have not been validated in the seated posture. So when you are seated, there's going to be orthostasis. The blood pooling will lead to decreased venous return. The baroreceptors are going to detect that, right? They're going to be unloaded. You increase systemic vascular resistance. No longer are you only measuring arterial stiffness. My intermediate outcome has now got some bias within it. But then, then we've got the reverse of that. Okay, if we need to put people back down after and wait for the hemodynamics to return, then we're not capturing the true effect of sitting either. So, you have to make some compromises, and there is no such thing as a perfect study, but you have to justify why you're doing it that way. And then, as I said, we do need to think about external fluidity, even at this stage, which is, your capacity to generalize your findings. And I say this because, we are at this preclinical mechanistic stage, but I'm looking at healthy adults. If I was looking at adults with diabetes, I probably would be working on an entirely different model, because with diabetes, your primary target is going to be glycemic control. You don't want to target that muscle pump. Not that you don't, it's just not going to be your main area of concern. You want to regulate glucose levels, and those strategies are going to be very different to the general population. So something you need to think about even at the preclinical stage. And as I said, we also need to think about ecological fluidity, which is realism, right? Does this play out in the real world? So we're looking at a strategy to interrupt sedentary behavior. Think before we start putting a lot of resources in it. Is this feasible? Like, are people ever going to actually do it? Is this worth studying? And time of day? Like, so we make vascular measurements, and we do it in the morning, because there is circadian variation, and everything affects the vasculature. So to maximize internal fluidity, we do it in the morning. But people don't just sit in the morning, right? So that's going to be something we're going to need to figure out down the line. And we'll come back to this. You don't just sit, you do other things while you sit, right? Lifestyle behaviors interact. So once we've done that, we start to figure out the mechanisms behind the behavior. Then we can really start to understand the behavior. And to do this, we need to define the problem and be specific. What is the specific behavior? Like, where are you sitting? How are you sitting? Who are you doing it with? Then we can start to select the target behavior and figure out what is the impact if we target that behavior. Can we measure it? Because we can only build an intervention. We can measure it. And is there behavioral interdependence, which I'll come back to? And then we can be specific about the target behavior in terms of who, what, when, where, how often, who with, right? And we need that, because we can't just tell people eat less, stop smoking, sit less. Doesn't work, right? And it's the same as using the fit prescription versus you should exercise more, right? Which one are you going to be more likely to adhere to? The fit prescription, right? And then once we've done this, then we can start to think what needs to change. And there are multiple levels that we can intervene at because we cannot separate the individual from interactions with their social and physical environments. So in terms of selecting that behavior and the target behavior, I said there is behavioral independence. You don't, unlike when you go for a run, generally you're just running, right? But when you're sitting, you might be eating a donut at your work, you're getting stressed out because you're having to do maths and other stuff, right? Those behaviors all interact and we can't ignore them. So now when we understand the behavior, its interactions, where it happens, like we've got a good understanding, then we can start to think about strategies that we can use to change that behavior. So we use a socio-ecological framework to think about things at the individual social and physical environment or level. And another way that adapting to is this COM-B model. So we're trying to motivate behavior change, which is dependent on capability. So these are all individual level factors, and opportunity, which would be dependent on the social and physical environment. So now we've identified, what we want to change, and we've identified targets. So like areas that we want to change. So we realize it's because the environment is not conducive to sedentary behavior. It's because there is lack of social support for that sedentary behavior. Then we can start to identify specific targets and tools for behavior change. So here's just an example at the different levels. So say social norms is an important one, like the people around you don't perceive this to be important. So you can intervene through modeling to change the social norms. Maybe it's accessibility in the physical environment, like there's no access to walks around the office, right, to interrupt your behavior or whatever it is. So maybe you give awareness or you remodel the environment, right? But when we understand those, then we can start to work forward and pick out specific strategies. So now we've done that, now we get to the intervention, right? So there's a lot of steps to get here. And in the intervention, we shouldn't forget feasibility. Feasibility is often used synonymously with pilot study, but it's much more involved. It's really challenging to run an efficacy or an effectiveness study. So we shouldn't forget that. And we should test that feasibility to determine whether we should actually do an efficacy study to start with, right? We might be putting all the resources in the wrong place. Then efficacy will test whether our interruption strategies have net benefit to the population under idealistic conditions or as controlled as we can. Then only then do we get to effectiveness, right? To see whether that intervention plays out under conditions that are more realistic of day-to-day activities. Again, we shouldn't forget feasibility. I throw this one up there because there are many stages to doing a feasibility study, and there are R01 grants developed around feasibility studies. This is the like the framework that the NCI uses, or Bowen's framework, and it goes through the different areas you should test and be able to indicate you're ready to do an intervention, and this intervention is ready to actually be done. Okay, so now we get to, we continue with intervention delivery. There are other things that we should do continuously throughout. We should be thinking about fidelity, right? How many people are doing it? We should be thinking about evaluation. Is it affordable? Is it accessible to different populations? Is it practical? Because these are things that you might need to tweak in order to improve its likelihood of actually being effective at the next stage, right? And then we have to also think about scalability. Just because it can work at our location doesn't mean you can do it somewhere else, right? And you have to show that for there to be nationwide policy. And this is the part that I know least about. Is the most challenging part, far more difficult than any physiology that I do. And this is basically implementation science. So now we have to think about, okay, we've developed these guidelines, But if we really want to get that A grade from the policymakers, we have to make sure that those guidelines are being delivered, right? So who's going to do that, right? If you're doing it in primary care, would it be the physician? Would it be a PA? Would it be a nurse? Or would they do it on an intake form? And then what would you deliver? What would it look like? What content? Would it be a pamphlet? Would it be stuff on screens? Would it be some kind of prescription? Where should you deliver it? When? Should it be at each visit, or is that too much of a burden? And then how, which is really difficult, how do you integrate this in the whole system of a medical practice? And, same questions can be answered in different locations beyond a primary care physician. So the take-home message here is policy development is a bloody long process, right? And I'm under no illusions. I'm not going to make any dent for at least 20 years on this, because there's so many things we have to consider. This is me and some of my grad students and postdocs and families the other day having a barbecue. There's my wife and my dog Harry. My students see a lot of my dog Harry. He gets dressed up in bow ties and kerchiefs and stuff all the time. Okay, so what does our roadmap look like? So I showed you this model before. We're somewhere down here right now, and we want to move to this, the efficacy stage, right? But, before we're really going to develop solid policy, we need to get to this stage where we're looking at implementation, but we are nowhere near right now. So a couple of the studies that we are doing, the first we call SWITCH, sitting with interruptions for total cardiovascular health. In this study, we're first doing a factorial crossover study that is going to look at those biological mechanisms and better understand that, so we can identify an optimal interruption strategy. And then we'll conduct formative research with those participants to get their ideas about, okay, that strategy worked. What would you think about if we give risk monitors to increase your self-efficacy or whatever it may be? And then we're going to determine the multidimensionality of sedentary behavior. So we'll follow a bunch of patients for 12 weeks and use socio-ecological models to, we will use a socio-ecological model, but we use an app to track their behaviors, like where they're doing it, what they're doing, who with, and then there'll be further formative research to conduct to further refine our socio-ecological model for sedentary behavior reduction. So it looks something like this. We want to interrupt this behavior, but based on our understanding of these mechanisms, right? So we can decrease arterial stiffness and mitigate the impact it's having on the cardiovascular system. And I've included the brain here because people forget that stroke is a cardiovascular disease, right? And vascular complications are leading to dementias and so on. But, to interrupt that behavior, we also have to better understand these different levels that motivate the sedentary behavior and the change in the behavior. And that brings us to our next study. So that first one is in middle-aged adults, because it just made most sense and it was sexiest for that particular study. But I'm really interested in young adults, not least because in the US, 70% of high school students go to college, and colleges are contained environments, right? That we have much more, a bigger chance of re-engineering than we do the country as a whole. So this one is called context. So we're trying to better understand the context in which sedentary behavior is occurring. So first, we will identify whether it's total sedentary behavior or a context-specific sedentary behavior that is most associated with cardiometabolic disease. So by context-specific, we're looking at things such as study time, transportation, screen time, etc. And then I said this behavioral interdependence, right? If we're going to interrupt sedentary behavior, we have to understand its interactions with other behaviors so that we can develop interventions that are going to be cognizant of those behaviors. So this next aim, we'll do a cluster analysis to see which behaviors are interdependent with it, and then see how much of the sedentary behavior explains the cardiometabolic disease versus the co-occurring behaviors. And then now when we understand the behavior and the co-occurring behaviors, we got a series of questionnaires that we're going to use to further develop our socio-ecological model that we use for intervention. And the whole thing is wrapped in an intervention mapping protocol, which we'll test the feasibility of in the next stage. So yeah, very similar to the last one. This is what our model looks like. We want to interrupt this behavior based on mechanisms. And in here, though, we really want to dig deep on these behaviors that are motivating it, and then come up with tools and strategies to change that that behavior. And here's how we're going to measure the context. So we have an inclinometer on fire. This is like the gold standard approach for looking at sedentary behavior. The actigraphs are not very good at measuring sedentary behavior. And then we use ecological moment. No, that's not it there. That's our sleep device that we put on the bed because we need the whole 24-hour day. But then we use ecological momentary analysis. So an app is on their phone, and 8 or 9 times a day, a prompt pops up and asks them about that behavior. Then the prompt goes through this series of questions. So we can get more information about that context and the context with respect to our socio-ecological model. Now, lastly, this one's a bit left of field, but I mentioned that we are genetically programmed to be sedentary, right? And we do want to understand this more as well. So I mentioned Hermans. He's a friend of mine. He's an evolutionary biologist, works at Duke. Over the last 20 years, he's done all this research and has come up with this constrained energy theory. And his book called Burn, where he talks about what this research is, amazing, but he's got tons of publications in this area too. But his theory, and he's shown this, he was the first to measure metabolism in apes, like using doubly labeled water, and now has done it on everything through rats, bottlenose dolphins, indigenous populations, everything. And it doesn't matter which species or how active they are, everyone fits on a line in terms of their total daily energy expenditure. He believes that it is constrained. So if you are physically active, you do not increase your total daily energy expenditure. What you do is you start to take energy away from non-essential processes, including inflammation, oxidative stress, things that lead to chronic disease. And this helps to explain why exercise does not work for weight loss. Again and again, we show it does not work. With maintenance, maybe, but with weight loss, and if you measure the total daily energy expenditure in that population, it does not go up. People compensate. So we're going to test that this theory, because he's done all this observational work, but not experimental work. So we're going to do a longitudinal adult study with these young adults and measure their energy expenditure at 2 points across the year and see whether there is a relationship between the degree of compensation that they have and arterial stiffness. Our hypothesis being those that compensate more, i.e. those that are taking that for a given level of physical activity are taking more energy away from non-essential processes, those are the people who are going to have better cardiovascular health. And then we're going to see if it's mediated by oxidative stress. And then we are going to do an 8-month intervention study where we're going to increase energy expenditure in these adults under highly controlled conditions. So collectively, from all of this, we'll start to understand the optimal dose for these sedentary behavior interruptions. We will hopefully, I don't think we're going to understand all of it, but we'll start to establish biological plausibility. We'll have a better understanding of the behavioral determinants, and then we're going to be in a position to actually design an intervention to test efficacy, before going on to effectiveness and implementation. So again, we're right here, but we want to work up towards those. And there are lots of steps in between here. This is just a simple map. And I think I'm being optimistic with 20 years before I make a dent, but this is my life. So hopefully then today we learned a bit about why sedentary behavior is important, took a step back in time, which I think is the fun part, looked at where the policy sits and how we change that policy and what my group is trying to do to help guide just a small piece of that policy. Questions? Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Yep. Right. I think I am optimistic. I'm a glass half full. I start all these grants because it'd take me a few weeks, and then 2 years later. So I'm optimistic, but I think we can use that, and I say that because that's a great place to build interventions. Like if we look at the workplace environment, and I do have a friend who was in that picture before, Bethany Brown Gibbs, had the first sedentary behavior interruption study, which she calls Reset BP. She's trying to lower blood pressure in people with pre-hypertension. So, and you can do that when you look at the socio-ecological perspective because you can re-engineer the environment there, right? Like you can make the bin, the trash can for you guys a bit further away from the desk. You can build routes around the office. If you can change the culture and change the social norms within there, and there's like people motivating one another, you can gamify the system. So I think there's just so many things that we can do. It's a contained environment, right? And that's why sedentary behavior interruption, we know it has great influence on health outcomes, but is a very ideal target. At least I'm very biased, but an ideal target, right? That's my optimistic view.
I just saw a paper where they were, when you work out, you're tired and your body does want to rest.
Mm-hmm.
The next day, they just did a study where they made people work hard, very, very hard mentally.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out the brain does the same thing. You go to TV and turn on.
Right.
I'm paraphrasing, but you need a rest. So how is so is sedentary behavior partly this result of being on all the time, of this
right.
stress that we have over here?
Yeah.
To sit on the
and that's part of the question, right? And why we're trying to look at these co-occurring behaviors, because none of them happen in isolation. And you change one, there's displacement. Something else, right? You have to replace it with something, and we just don't have enough understanding. But and in that kind of environment, we're trying to look at some of this. The stress is going to further exacerbate some of the effects of the sedentary behavior on the cardiovascular system. Yeah, and that's going to affect the reward pathways and stuff like that. So it gets so complicated. But that's why it's not just about like saying, oh, you need to sit only 6 hours a day, right? Because it's far more nuanced than that. But it's fascinating. I'm looking forward to answering more of these. And we've done some of it, but we still need a lot more evidence.
I've read some stuff about children, prepubertal children have sort of this short-lived activity that's kind of ingrained in their brain, I guess, and so it's just innate for kids to get up and move for a short period of time, and then they go back to sedentary behavior. Like your intervention of how we break sedentary behavior with these intermittent periods. And then I remember reading that somewhere around puberty, the central nervous system actually changes to sort of dampen that innate short burst activity. I don't know, are you familiar with that? Do you think there's anything going on there as we get older? There's some
Yeah, I think there's more going on with the kids because their anaerobic systems are more developed than aerobic as well. And they've got bigger body surface area relative to their heart size, right? That's why kids like to run fast and then do nothing for a bit and then running it. Same as dogs, right? There's a lot of similarities. But I think, yeah, I mean, there is some stuff there and the mechanisms are likely to be different. But I do think that is one area that I think there's potential for a lot of impact, and we need to think much bigger picture. Like we're facing a losing battle with putting physical activity back in schools, right? Not just in the US, across the world, because the key outcome is standardized tests, and physical activity doesn't help with that. Yeah, it does. We know that it does. There's lots of evidence, but we're not presenting it in a way that policymakers like. But we need to speak on their terms, and I think sedentary behavior is one area with schools where we could start to break up behavior and add in those kind of short bouts. But let's be strategic about it, right? The teachers care about how well they're going to do on those standardized tests because there's going to be a reward for them. So get them to do one of those short bursts before they do a complex math problem, and put that complex math problem in the first part of the class, right? I think we need to think much bigger picture of how we do these things, because we just keep taking that standard physiological approach for it. It's having no impact, and we keep telling people, well, health of our kids is bad, etc. Like we should be doing this, and everyone knows, and it's the same all over the world, but it's making no difference, right? So I think we need to speak in terms that's actually going to have an impact.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment about context. Has there been other studies that have what have been found in their context?
There has with questionnaire-based data, and like consistently, screen time has the greatest association with health outcomes. Screen time, though, also happens to be the behavior that you can measure much more precisely, right? So is it screen time, or is it just the fact we can recall that much better? And there is a data set at the NCI, the eye data set, where the guy there, Matthew, I'm forgetting his name, but developed this at 24 survey that's basically a 24-hour time use survey, and he's got some of that in there, and there is some of it's there that there may not be a lot on it right now, but we can dig into because that's more nuanced than some of this other questionnaire data. Right. I think so. And now that smartphones are ubiquitous, right? And then we're not necessarily going to preclude certain populations from having one because most of the world has one. And don't get me wrong, we still have, like for our study, brought cell phones and contracts, and we've got them ready to go just in case someone doesn't have a phone, or their phone doesn't run very well, or they just don't want to use it. Like we've got those available, but I don't know if we're actually going to give any out. We're paying for these contracts each year and spending thousands of dollars, but we have to have it just in case. So that stuff does help. Like everything can be monitored now, but the problem is though the monitoring is overkill. We're not necessarily making best use of it. And the app that we're doing, this stuff can be very expensive, but this one is free, developed by a Australian group called SEMA Free. We tried others, and this one works the best, and we don't have to pay anything.
Is there open source data sets that already have sedentary behavior analysis? Like, just think about like your iPhone right now is tracking where you move or your Apple Watch. And there's open source data sets that allow you to evaluate that. But you know the name of open source.
I don't know, like Apple Watch. No way, right? Apple not giving you any data. There is like Fitbit and stuff. That eye data set that I said has data on accelerometry, inclinometers, and heart rate monitors as well. You can go and put a proposal in and use that data. And then there are other data sets. They're not necessarily open source. Like there are some, like NHANES is open. So like you can go and there's some sedentary behavior stuff in there, but there are big cohort studies that, you know, they're NIH funded, so they have to have some data availability. You can go and put a proposal in and do it. And like I think cardia is another good one. I've got a student doing something with that. I think the MESA study may have some. So it's out there. Not it wasn't designed to look at the behavior, but some of it is there.
Question. So like when it comes to food surveys, people always underestimate how much they're eating.
All right.
Aren't very accurate. The quantity that they're eating. So when people fill out like surveys about their collectively behavior, do you find that they were underestimating sedentary?
Oh, well over. Like the all the stuff we see about, that's why it's good when you see the objective stuff, right? Because all the stuff we see and where it says, oh, 50% of the population are active, you know, to use British vernacular, is absolute bollocks. Like you look at the objective data, it's more like 10%, right? It's not, no, yeah, there are very few people that are doing it. So self-report is notoriously bad, but if it's notoriously bad across a big population and there is random sampling and, you know, you don't fit any biases into it, you can address questions. They may not be precise, but you can still look at relationship between A and B and so on. Yeah, I mean, again, there's no perfect research, right?
All right, well, let's get Dr.
Thank you.